Um, Kyle, can you hear me? Oh, is it my turn? Oh, I'm not trying to start.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is my first time doing this. Just getting used to the software and stuff here. Yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. Um, so when I read this question, the first thing that jumps out to me is the word right. All nations should have a right to nuclear weapons. When I see that word, we talk about that a lot, especially on an individual level. Each individual has a right to life, to liberty, to property, those kinds of things. We have a right to pursue our own self-interest, and I believe like that right to pursue our own self-interest extends to all sovereign entities. I believe states are sovereign. And I think most people wouldn't disagree that the United States is a sovereign nation, that we have our own right to pursue our own self-interest as we see fit. So, and of course, we don't always abide by it, but we shouldn't interfere with other people's ability to pursue their self-interest. So that being said, I believe that nations do have a right to pursue a nuclear weapons program if they so choose. Now that being said, let me say from the outset here, I do not agree with the use of nuclear weapons. I'm pro-peace. I wish nuclear weapons didn't exist, but the fact is they do. It'd be an alternate universe if we were to sit here and talk about a world that didn't have nuclear weapons. The fact is they exist, and we've got to kind of cope with that. So I think to say that some nations are worthy of having nuclear weapons and others aren't would be to say that those nations who aren't worthy of having them aren't in fact sovereign, and that somebody else is more sovereign than they are, and they're able to say, we can control you, and if you don't do as we say, then we'll seek other options to get you to do what we say. So while I don't agree with nuclear weapons, I certainly think that every country should have the right to, if they so choose. With that said, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you and let you lay out your argument.
Okay, I tend to agree with you to an extent. I think that it's very important that we recognize a nation's ability to look out for their own interests, and I think that that's a reason that a lot of countries lately, especially, have been taking to the border arguments and trying to, make their countries more kind of their country and set down lines. Now, you say that you're for peace, but you're pro any country having a right to nuclear weapons. Now, you said that you recognize states, territories and states and independent countries and territories. So I looked up just to see how many countries there are. And according to the United Nations, there's about 241. The lowest I've read is like 190. And most countries don't have access to nuclear weapons. And it's probably a good thing, because out of those 241 countries and territories, because if you're going to go ahead and recognize all of them, some of them are less capable, I think, with the power of a nuclear weapon than others. But I don't think it even comes down to that. I think that more importantly, it comes down to the fact that around 1968 into 1970, in the 70s, the Non-Proliferation Treaty for countries that had nuclear weapons was signed, essentially saying that that other countries will get rid of their nuclear weapons once people in this treaty start getting rid of them. And the problem is, it's essentially a standoff. It's essentially who's going to put down their gun first, because people realize the threat that nuclear weapons offer, because they don't offer the threat of a war, really. What they offer is the threat of annihilation. And that's different than any war we've fought, any bomb we've dropped, really, because of the fact that it would just absolutely, with the power we have. I was reading something really interesting where it said that the United States, every single one of our nuclear subs, which there's a bunch of that are currently out, has more destructive power on it than all of the wars in history combined. Now, what can you do with that? I mean, what can you solve with that kind of power? And giving more countries that power doesn't create less problems in the world. In fact, it just creates more problems, because then countries countries have a way to retaliate it. So I agree with nuclear weapons. The Nobel Prize Committee, a lot of Nobel Peace Prize winners have said that they're very against nations having them. And Israel is a very good example of a country that has nuclear weapons, that isn't supposed to have them, that lied about having them for decades. And Israel is really a perfect example of a nation that could trigger at any moment a nuclear war because of.
All right, so I agree with you. I mean, like I said, nuclear weapons are a terrible thing. But the fact of the matter is my question to you is how would we get rid of them? Somebody has to have that ability to say, no more nuclear weapons. I'm all for a voluntary agreement where everybody gets together and says, no, we're all going to get rid of our nuclear weapons, no more. I think that's a great idea. I think that's a great, voluntary thing. But what happens if countries don't give up? What happens when North Korea says, no, I'm not giving up my nuclear weapons? And so when that happens, somebody has to be the enforcement arm. If people aren't going to give them up voluntarily, somebody has to be the enforcement arm. I remember back in the the Republican debates, the primary debates, when they talked about no-fly zones in Syria, and Chris Christie famously said, not only would I be willing to shoot down Russian planes, I will shoot down Russian planes. I don't think that's the answer. Similarly here, if we have some kind of global ban on nuclear weapons and somebody says no, you have to have some kind of enforcement arm there. And what happens when those countries don't comply? I think you're barking down the wrong tree, and the banning of such weapons could actually lead to more conflict by having to enforce it.
Well, I understand those points, and I think they're valid points. But my main objective here is to stress the fact that you wouldn't be fighting a war. Shooting a gun or dropping a small bomb is very, very different than having a nuclear war. I mean, just the ash alone that it would kick up would make life uninhabitable, size, radiation. I mean, there's just so many different after effects that firing a nuclear weapon would cause. And proliferating them and just having more of them and more people having them is not a way to solve that problem. I guess an analogy would be if you were in a saloon or something and 3 people pulled out guns and they were kind of pointing them at each other. Your best strategy would not be to give other people in the room guns, so more people have guns to protect themselves. I'm very pro-gun and I'm very pro-protecting yourself, but I believe when you have a weapon that essentially's only purpose is to annihilate life as much as possible in the greatest space possible, in the shortest time possible, it's not a war. And so I think it's really important for us to stress the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and to get countries like Israel and North Korea in line and say, listen, if you're going to have nuclear weapons, you need to be responsible with them. And you need to let people know about them. Because currently Israel just lies to everybody, basically, and North Korea is using them essentially as a weapon to threaten the West with. Now, what good does us having a nuclear weapon do? Or Russia, or China, or any of the countries? It doesn't really offer anything except a threatening way, a menacing way to kind of, everybody is on the edge of their seat right now. And the countries that already have nuclear weapons, there's a really great documentary, I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but it's about a guy, a Russian submariner who was stationed outside of Cuba, and he had a nuclear tipped missile in his sub that he had the ability to fire if he so chose. They lost contact with Russia. Information was for radio. And JFK wasn't sure what to do because they knew about this sub and they weren't sure what to do. So they tried to use depth charges to make it come up. And it was really, really close to the point where one of the people, you had 2 keys that you had to put in. One of the people put their keys in and the other person refused to do it and said, listen, I'm in charge, we're not going to do this. And so they surfaced. But if they had fired that weapon, I mean, just having those weapons available in the tense situations we're in is not something I think will solve anything. So I agree with you on a lot of points. I just don't understand why you think that having weapons for everyone would make anybody safer.
So I think we're talking a little bit of cross purposes here. I think having the right to doesn't necessarily mean that everyone would. I mean, there's a ton of countries in the world that just flat out don't have the capability, as you kind of touched on earlier. So I don't think we're talking about 200 sovereign nations having nukes throughout the world. But the real hang-up for me is still the enforcement arm. If you want to get rid of nuclear weapons and flat out tell every country in the world that they're not allowed to have them, who's in charge of that? Who's doing it? And who enforces it? If somebody says no, I'm not giving up my weapons, what do you do about that? Are you willing to engage in a conflict with a country who either already has nuclear weapons or is wanting to have them? Are you willing to engage in conflict with them, with an otherwise peaceful nation that hasn't done anything presumably before that? Are you willing to engage in conflict with them just to enforce not having nuclear weapons?
All great points. But again, I go back to the question of what does giving more people, even if it's not giving them nuclear weapons, even if it's just giving them the right to have nuclear weapons, which I think, it could easily be argued that they have the right to get nuclear weapons if they want to. There's international law that they might be violating, or the UN, but really when it comes down to it, you could argue that since they're their own country, and other countries have done it. So I don't think there's anything keeping a lot of countries from doing it, other than the fact that they just realize that it's useless, and that all it is that, and that's why the largest military industrial complex nations like Russia and US and China and Israel and North Korea are all the ones with nukes, whereas the countries like Norway and Sweden and stuff who probably don't give two shits about having another world war don't see the point in having them. So I like I said, I agree. And your question before about how would we get rid of them, who would organize that, those are all great questions. Those are the questions that need to be asked, because I don't necessarily know. I think the NPT was a good start, and that we should hold those nations accountable. I think countries like Israel and North Korea that are either lying about having nuclear weapons or refusing to allow anyone to see them should have to have some kind of accountability. But when you're talking about a country like North Korea, who doesn't even want to deal with us in any shape, way, or form, they're not going to let us in to see their nukes. But us having nukes this isn't going to benefit us in any way. If we can get rid of the people who we know are using them the most menacingly, then I think that would be a good start. But then again, it's who drops the weapon first. So I think that the questions you asked are all good and valid questions, and those are the things that we need to be addressing. But giving more nations the right, or allowing it to be international law that any nation or country or territory or whatever you want to say can have their own nuclear weapons, is just not a productive way, especially since you're a peaceful guy. You sound very peaceful. So I don't think, if you would think about this more, that the questions that you have towards me are great questions to have for yourself, the future of our world, and that in a shape or form, giving more countries nuclear weapons would solve this, because it won't. It just won't.
And like I said, I agree to an extent that I don't like the fact that we have to have nuclear weapons. I think that let's use the North Korea example, because I think we can both agree that North Korea is kind of the belligerent owner of nuclear weapons. Everybody else seems to be relatively responsible with them, to this far anyways. But North Korea is a relatively small nation. I think that I think their population is right around 25 million or so, and provided they could come up with the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, to get a nuclear warhead here, knowing that we have nukes, I think would deter them. I don't think they're super intelligent, but at the same time, I don't think they're that dumb to think that they can just launch a nuke and not go unretaliated against. I hate that it comes down to that, but like I said earlier, if somebody's unwilling to give up those weapons, then there has to be somebody who's willing to take them away, and that's the real part that I can't get past. I think the ability of having nukes, the nuclear power, is kind of a self-policing power. People aren't going to want to launch nukes at other people who have nukes. I think it's just it's a terrible, terrible way to go. So I can't get past a start, even if it's not a nuclear war, that we would start by enforcing it against North Korea, for example. Even if it's just a regular war that we went in there and tried to occupy their country to get their nukes out. I don't see that as a great alternative to just letting them kind of do their own thing and hope they don't do anything, because I just don't see the alternative of, or the how we get past the enforcement arm issue. If they're not willing to give them up, how do we take them away?
I think those are really, really good points, and I would say that you said that North Korea is probably one of the most irresponsible. I think North Korea and Israel, and I'll really stress those 2 points, because those 2 countries are the countries that, I mean, even though we're friends with Israel, Obama, people always say he's very, very anti-Israel. He promised them $30 billion over 10 years, 28 billion to be specific. So we're not anti-Israel, and the fact that they lied to us for decades and said we don't have nuclear weapons, we don't know anything about them, we don't want them in the Middle East, and we sure as hell wouldn't want to be the first person with them. Well, they've been lying for decades, and now just recently the Pentagon officially announced that we know that they have nuclear weapons. They still won't let anybody see them, count them, know what capabilities they have, but Israel is one of the most volatile places in countries right now, as far as, I mean, the settlements and stuff is a completely different discussion, but North Korea is the same way. North Korea doesn't want to have any other country come in and look at them or know what kind of capabilities they have. They're more braggadocious in the sense that they're more threatening with them. And I think that it's good that at this point we have them. So I'm not disagreeing that nuclear weapons in some regard are a good thing, because they can be. Like you said, they're a deterrent. I think that if we didn't have them at some point, maybe Russia would have made a move. Who knows? It could have been like that movie Red Dawn. But I don't think at this point, as developed as we are as a society intellectually and philosophically, and as a humanitarian culture, that we can just keep saying that these are options that we need to be looking at. So I think that the question we need to be asking ourselves is, how are we going to disarm all nations, and where do we start, and how do we begin this procedure? Because just allowing more nations to arm themselves, again, will not make anything better. And I think that it's important that the nations who have them should at least let people in to see them. So I think that it should definitely just ring home a little bit that this is why it's not encouraged, because countries who get their hands on them use them for nefarious purposes. Most countries who have them don't use them just for protection. They're trying to use them eventually for war if they need to. And the example I provided about the Russian sub is another instance of just where I wanted to say how close we've come to nuclear war. And that's just something we know about. That's something that's been unclassified. I can't imagine how many times that we have been close to nuclear war.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we should be able to take whatever steps necessary to get rid of nuclear weapons. Like I said at the outset, I don't believe that anybody should have be able to use the power and just sheer annihilation that comes with owning a nuclear weapon. But the problem is that I continue to go back to it, because I don't know how we would get past forcing countries to to give them up. Look at it, you bring up Israel, and I was big on North Korea. Israel's another problem too, especially where they're located. They are in the most volatile place in the world, but to this point, I think Israel is smart enough to understand that a unprovoked launch of a nuclear warhead would certainly mean, pretty disastrous things for them in the long term, based on, other countries retaliating and just, economic sanctions and other things that would be placed on them by the Western world for an unprovoked launch of a nuclear weapon. I think they understand that means, pretty bad news for them in the long run. I don't think they'd be willing to do it, although I may underestimate them. If countries aren't willing to use them, you mentioned a bunch of countries earlier, that they don't see it as it being in their best interest to own them. I think that's great. I wish more countries would do that. But as long as there are countries out there that are unwilling to get rid of their militarized nuclear programs, then I think it's best that other countries have the right to pursue them as well. Just for the sake of protection and just kind of guaranteeing that so if somebody launches one, we're going to launch one too, and I think that's enough to deter both parties from engaging in that kind of behavior.
I think another reason, good points by the way, I think another reason that I'm very against the idea of more countries having them is because I've seen what's happening with, I keep on bringing up Israel, but Israel and North Korea are just two great examples. Israel specifically because, like you said, where they're located and how tense that region is. Israel will, I believe personally that Israel it shouldn't exist, but that's just my personal belief. Now, there's a lot of other people who feel that way, and even Jewish people who feel that way. But Israel's never going to give up Israel. And now that they have nuclear weapons, I'd almost be willing to bet my life on it that they would use them before they would give up their country. And that's not to say it wouldn't be an unprovoked instance. I mean, they've been invading Palestinian soil for years. Ever since they got the territory, they've been trying to take up as much land as they possibly can. And so I think it's not necessarily about what we see right now, because hindsight is 2020. Saying that Israel's exists in the 40s or 30s, and now we don't know what countries, if they were to acquire them, nameless countries to us now, later on could be huge threats, and could be threats not just to our sovereignty or our country or our safety, but other countries. So I think making sure that the weapons that are out there are only in a few countries' hands is the best option. I don't see the countries who have them, even the like gruesome ones like North Korea, for instance, using them on South Korea. They're close enough to, and it would be isolated enough, but they're not using those kinds of weapons now, and they're not using them on anyone else because, like you said, they know that there would be hell to pay. So I do think that it's good to have an international presence and have a lot of people that are being more responsible with them, but I do not believe that any more countries should have them. And so I guess I just have to reiterate that point, is that having more weapons will not make us safer when it comes to these kinds of weapons, because these serve no purpose but annihilation. And they obviously don't deter anyone, because people are still willing to fight with North Korea. But now we have the problem of, if we have to go into Israel or North Korea or any other country, Russia, China, that has nuclear weapons, we have to worry about them attacking. So the more countries that have that, like I said, hindsight is 2020, but we don't know what the future is. So we don't know if some nameless country to us now will have those kinds of weapons and use them for nefarious purposes.
All good points, but I still have to come back to what extent are you willing to go to kind of step on another country's foot, or to overthrow their own sovereignty, to tell them no. If a country really wants to do it, who are we to tell them they can't? And while we don't think it's a good idea, and it's similar to drug use. I'm a libertarian. I believe that adults have a right to put in their body whatever they want to. I would advise highly against the use of drugs. I wouldn't advise anybody to go out and use heroin, but it's their right to. Same with nuclear weapons. I wouldn't advise any country to go out and start up a militarized nuclear program, but they have every right to. And while I wish they didn't, who are we to tell them that they can't? And so that's the real issue I have here. And to what extent are we willing to go to stop people from producing such a kind of a nuclear program?
Okay. Sorry about that. The NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is a really good start. And I think anybody who's interested in this debate or these subjects should look it up and actually learn more about it. I'm just going to read a quick bit of it. This is just the central bargain for it. Non-nuclear weapon states agree never to acquire nuclear weapons, and the NPT nuclear weapon states in exchange agree to share the benefits of peaceful nuclear technology and to pursue nuclear disarmament aimed at the ultimate elimination of their nuclear arsenals. I know that at some point, this is such a long article, and I thought the debate was going to be a lot later for some reason, so I didn't save as much as I wanted to. But I believe that there was something that they were trying to do where essentially they would say, each year we're going to get rid of X amount. But it's hard when countries don't let us know what they have. So I think that it would probably begin with countries just getting rid of the majority of their supply. And I think that would take a big leap of trust, and I think that would take faith for some people. But I think hopefully people have realized, especially with the international community coming together, because currently that it's saying 91 of August, 191 states have adhered to the treaty. So that's a lot of freaking countries that are interested in this and that are willing to do this, that have signed for it. So we just have to enforce it. So the questions that you asked are valid questions that a lot of them have been answered with this specific piece of legislation, and we've agreed to it, and yet the problems persist. So I think we need to be addressing how do we get this treaty to take effect.
And again, I think the nuclear proliferation treaty is a great thing, but again, those are countries coming together voluntarily to say, hey, we're not going to do this. I think if we could get the whole world to do that, that's a great thing to end the likelihood of a nuclear war or nuclear attack on anyone. But that doesn't change the fact that there are still probably going to be those countries that say, no, screw you, I'm not giving up my program. And if you want it gone, then come and take it. I think we're still going to have to deal with those issues, and that's my big struggle. I'm not willing to start a new war with anyone that has been otherwise peaceful, who just says, I'm not giving up my stuff. I'm a sovereign state, and you're telling me I can't have these things. I think I should have them. Sorry, I'm not giving them up. I don't think that's worth starting a war over. That's why I think that like I said, I think the treaty is a great thing. I wish we could get everybody on board with it, but that's just not the reality. And so in order to deal with the reality, I think it's worth just allowing people to have them rather than try and forcibly overtake them and do something about it that could end in a much worse scenario. Maybe.
Okay. Well, as of right now, from the NPT, only 4 UN member states have never accepted it, and that's India, Israel, Pakistan, and South Sudan, founded in 2011, has not joined. I think that if we could convince those countries, because the majority of countries agree that this is something that we should get away from. I think it's more about persuading these countries the benefits of peace and the benefits of these kinds of agreements rather than focusing our attention on, because we're not going to attack a country just because they won't get rid of their nukes. I mean, Israel is our ally supposedly, and we can't even see theirs, let alone they won't even tell us much about them. Anything we get is pretty much leaked. So I think the first thing is holding nations accountable that have them and saying, listen, if you want to have them, that's great. If you want to be a sovereign nation, that's fine. But if you're going to be able to basically annihilate entire parts of the globe, other people should have access to the knowledge of what you have. So I really just do not agree at all with the proliferation of nuclear arms. I think that only through getting rid of them, which is a difficult process, can we have peace. And giving more nations the ability to have them when they've clearly shown up, except for 4, that they don't want them. So this isn't like there's a lot of countries that really, really want nuclear weapons that don't have them. There's only 4 that have officially gone and said, we're not going to sign this. So if we could address those 4 nations and not cater to the minority, I think we could make a lot more progress.
So I agree. I think if we can convince them and get them to, join in on the treaty voluntarily, I think that's a great thing. I think if we believe that people shouldn't have nuclear arms, then I believe it is our responsibility, our obligation to go and convince them not to have them. But that still doesn't address the fact that, what happens when they say no, then what do we do? I don't think, you said we're not going to attack a country that just because they don't give up our nuclear arms. Well, what are we going to do then? What do we do when they flat out say, no, I want to keep my nuclear program, and if you got a problem with it, then do something about it. I don't know what we do when that happens. Like I said, if we can get them to get rid of their nukes voluntarily, I think that's a great start. But I don't know what we do when they say no, we're not going to do it.
If they say no, we're not going to do it, perfect example is Israel. I think we should cut them off, at least from the United States financially. I think that we should levy sanctions and make their life difficult. If they're going to possess world-ending destruction tools, and they're going to refuse to let anyone else know about them when they're living in the most volatile, one of the most volatile parts of the world, and they're instigating most of it. I mean, it's only a matter of time before something bad happens. So we really need to start punishing countries at not going out of our way to invade them, but at least stopping to help them. Because what we've been doing is giving, for instance, Israel and North Korea, we've been giving them aid, and I don't think we should be. And I've only got a minute left, and you've got like 5, so I figure I should let you talk a little more.
Yeah, I've been keeping my answers a little short. So as far as the sanctions go, and one country we haven't brought up, which I'm not sold that they ever had a nuclear program, was Iran. I think there's, you heard a lot in the mainstream media about them having a nuclear program. I don't think they. I think there's a lot of evidence out there to suggest that they weren't, enriching uranium to that to weaponize grade. But we did levy a bunch of sanctions on them. I actually heard this in an interview with Scott Horton a few days ago, that a guy with the National Iranian American Council or something, they did a study as to what well, I just went brain dead. What those sanctions did, not only in terms of the Iranian economy, but in terms of the U.S. economy, and they concluded that those sanctions on Iran cost the U.S. economy $290 billion since 1995, and $105 billion since just over the past 4 to 5 years. So I think Israel's a big partner, a trade partner. They have a big tech industry there. I think sanctioning them because they're unwilling to give up their nuclear weapons, while we don't think they should have them, you're also going to punish a lot of Americans, and we're going to see those effects in the American economy. I don't necessarily know that that's a road we want to go down. I guess you got to pick your battles. If you want to say, I'm willing to let the American economy suffer to a degree just to get rid of nuclear weapons, that's one thing. Other people might be unwilling to make that sacrifice. So again, how do we, if we're unwilling to do that, if we're unwilling to, get into some kind of armed conflict with them over it, I still don't know, how we regulate it. When somebody says, no, if you want to come and take them, if we shut them off, I think sanctions are an act of war as well. I mean, when you tell people that they can't buy things from other countries, I think that's an act of war. That's a invasion of their own sovereignty when you tell them that they can't buy things from other countries. So I don't necessarily know that's the right road to go down either. I don't know what the right road is. I agree with you that we need to try and get as many people as we can to voluntarily enter into agreements. I just don't know how you go about solving it when people are unwilling to enter into those voluntarily.
I think that the example you were providing about the sanctions in Iran, I agree with you that I don't know if they actually had nuclear weapons or if that's what they were even trying to do. But I think our politicians were inept then, and they have been for decades, and I'm glad personally that I feel that our country is on the right path. I feel that a country like Israel, we could sanction not just for the nuclear weapons, but also for their human rights abuses and their constant human rights abuses that are documented very well by the UN, as well as North Korea doing the same thing with human rights abuse.
And I mean, I understand. I'm kind of in the same boat with you. I don't like the U.S. alliance with Israel. I think Israel has done a lot of terrible things. Honestly, I haven't looked into it enough to know what, you made a pretty bold claim that you don't think Israel should exist. I don't know about that. I haven't done a lot of reading about it, but but I do know that I do not like our friendship with them, and how we feel compelled to act on their behalf anytime, even if they are doing things wrong. I understand the human rights violations and stuff, but I still think, even given, I think human rights violations are terrible. I'd be willing to sacrifice some economic activity here in the States to curb human rights violations. But for a country who's never used, or that I know have even hinted at the use of nuclear weapons to sacrifice, American well-being, in the American economy, to prove a point like that, I don't know if it's necessarily worth it. I just don't, like I said, I don't know how you go about enforcing it. So, I mean, that's pretty much all I got. I mean, I don't know. Like I said, you got 13 seconds left, but if you want to add something, you can. I mean, I don't know. I think the only way to get past this is just to allow countries that want to have them, they're allowed to have them, and if we don't want them to have them, it's our job to convince them otherwise. Let's sweeten some trade deals. Let's do some things and say, hey, we're open for business. If you want to do business, let's do it. But the only deal is you can't have nukes. If they want to agree to that, fine. But it's their right as sovereign states to do so. They have the ability to enter into the agreements they want to, and to abstain from the agreements they don't want to. And when they don't want to, it is what it is. We may not like it, but it's not really our place to say, no, you can't do this.
Well, thank you. Oh, shit, I already used some of my time. Well, thank you so much for debating. I think that great points, both sides, but I still think that keeping weapons away from people is the best option for this.